You know how sometimes you feel like you're studying so hard, but it's like nothing's actually sinking in, like you're just going through the motions?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Well, it turns out a lot of what we think is effective studying is kind of like busy work. You know what I mean? It doesn't actually lead to real learning.
That's so true. It's fascinating how much time and effort people put into studying, but then they don't get the results they're looking for.
So today we're going deep into the science of how we actually learn and remember. And honestly, the evidence is pretty surprising. Like it challenges a lot of the common assumptions we have about studying.
Right. And what's amazing is that this isn't just some new fad or trend. This is based on over a century of research by cognitive scientists,
Yeah.
people who actually study how the brain works.
Exactly. And we're drawing on some really insightful work from folks like Henry Roediger and Mark McDaniel. They're like leading experts in this field.
And they've teamed up with Peter Brown, who's this amazing storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
He really brings the science to life,
Right.
makes it really engaging.
And their research shows that a lot of the techniques we rely on for studying are like shockingly inefficient. So today we're going to give you some actionable strategies that are grounded in science so you can learn more effectively and feel more confident in your ability to retain information.
Yeah, and it's not just about like acing a test or something. It's about really understanding and remembering information that can help you in all aspects of your life, whether it's your career, your hobbies, just being a more well-rounded person.
All right, so let's get into it. One of the most common study methods that people use is just rereading their textbooks and notes.
Right.
Like we all do that.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It feels like you're absorbing the information,
Right.
like when you go over it again and again.
Yeah, you start to recognize it and you think, okay, I got this.
But here's the thing. Studies have shown that over 80% of college students rely heavily on rereading. And it turns out it's actually one of the least effective ways to learn something for the long term.
Really?
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing, right? You might feel like you know the material because you can recognize it, but that doesn't mean you can actually recall it from memory or apply it in a different context.
So all those hours I spent highlighting and rereading my notes, maybe not the best use of my time.
It happens to the best of us. What rereading often does is create this illusion of knowing. You become familiar with the words on the page, but your brain kind of tricks you into thinking that familiarity equals actual understanding.
Oh, I've totally been there. Like during an exam, I'll see a question and think, oh yeah, I've read about this. But then I can't actually remember the answer.
And there's research to back this up. Psychologist 𝐒𝐓𝐈𝐂𝐊 did this really interesting study where people repeatedly read lists of words without knowing they'd be tested on them later.
Okay.
And what they found was that those repeated readings didn't actually give them any advantage when they had to learn a new list of words.
So basically just seeing the information over and over again doesn't make it stick.
Exactly. It's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. You might be pouring in the information, but it's just leaking right out.
That makes sense. You know, it reminds me of this thing I heard about called the fire hose method. It's like this intense training where they just blast you with information nonstop for days.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the idea is that if you're exposed to enough information, something's got to stick.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the idea that quantity equals quality, but that's not really how our brains work.
And what's funny is that you still see advice out there saying that repetition is key to learning, like even from universities and stuff.
It's so interesting how there's this disconnect between what we intuitively think works and what the research actually shows.
So if just rereading isn't the answer, what should we be doing instead?
Well, the research is overwhelmingly clear on this. Retrieval practice is the way to go.
Retrieval practice.
Yeah, it's basically the act of actively trying to recall information from your memory.
Yeah.
So instead of just passively reading or reviewing something, you're actually forcing your brain to work to retrieve it.
So like using flashcards?
Exactly. Flashcards are a great example. Or doing practice questions.
Yeah.
Or even just trying to explain a concept to someone else without looking at your notes.
Okay, so it's about making yourself actively think about the information.
Yeah, and every time you do that, you're strengthening the neural pathways associated with that knowledge.
It's like building a muscle, right? The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
Spot on. And the research is really compelling. There was this study done in a middle school where they had some students who were quizzed regularly throughout the semester.
Okay.
And then they had another group of students who just reviewed the material by rereading it. Well, a month later, the students who were quizzed averaged an A on a test on the material, while the students who just reviewed averaged a C+.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
And it really highlights the power of retrieval practice. And there are two main benefits to it. First, it helps you figure out what you actually know. and what you don't know.
Hmm.
So you can focus your studying on the areas where you need more work.
Makes sense.
And second, the act of successfully recalling information actually helps to solidify that memory in your brain.
So it's like you're reinforcing the connections every time you retrieve it.
Exactly. And it makes it more likely that you'll be able to recall that information again in the future.
Okay, so we've got to be actively trying to remember things. Now, the sources also talk about this idea of spaced repetition.
Right, and this is another really important principle. It basically means that spreading out your study sessions over time is much more effective than cramming everything in at once.
I mean, that makes sense, but it's so hard to resist cramming sometimes, right?
I know, it's tempting to try to get it all done in one go,
Hmm.
but it's just not how our brains work best. When you space out your learning, you're giving your brain time to forget some of the information.
Okay.
And then when you go back and relearn it, it's like you're strengthening those neural pathways even more.
So it's like each time you forget and relearn something, it becomes more ingrained in your memory.
Exactly.
Oh.
It's like you're building a stronger foundation for that knowledge each time.
All right, so spaced repetition. Spread out my studying. Got it. Now, what about interleaving? What's that all about?
So interleaving is this really cool technique where you mix up the subjects or topics you're studying. Instead of focusing on one thing for a long time, you switch between different things.
Interesting. Give me an example.
Sure, let's say you're studying math and you're learning about different types of equations. With block practice, you might do a bunch of problems on one type of equation, then move on to the next type. But with interleaving, you would mix up those problems.
So like one problem on quadratic equations, then one on linear equations, and so on.
Exactly. And it might feel harder at first because you're constantly having to switch gears, but it actually helps you to learn the material better.
How so?
Well, it forces you to think more deeply about the concepts and how they relate to each other. You're not just memorizing steps, you're understanding the underlying principles.
So it's like you're training your brain to see the connections between things.
Exactly. And it also helps you to better distinguish between different concepts, which is really important when you're trying to apply that knowledge in real life.
Okay, so interleaving helps us to learn and discriminate. Now, the sources also talk about this concept of generation.
Yeah, generation is all about actively trying to come up with an answer or solution before you're shown the correct one.
So like trying to solve a math problem before looking at the answer key.
Exactly. Even if you get it wrong, the act of trying helps to prime your brain to better learn the correct answer.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, when you try to generate an answer yourself, you're actively engaging with the material.
Yeah.
You're thinking about it, you're making connections, and that makes you more receptive to the information when you finally see the correct answer.
It's like you're creating a mental framework for that knowledge.
That's a great way to put it. And it's been shown to be really effective for improving memory.
Okay, generation, try to figure it out on my own before I look up the answer. Got it. Now, what about mental models? I'm not really sure what those are.
So mental models are basically mental representations of how things work. They're like simplified versions of reality that help us to understand complex systems.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine you're trying to learn how a bicycle works. You can just memorize the names of all the parts.
Yeah.
But that wouldn't really help you to understand how they all work together to make the bike move.
Right.
But if you create a mental model of the bike, you can start to see how the pedals turn the gears, which turn the wheels, and so on. You're building a framework for understanding the system.
So it's like having a mental picture of how things are connected.
Exactly. And mental models can be really helpful for learning all sorts of things, from science and math to history and literature.
Okay, so mental models.
Yeah.
Simplify complex systems. Now let's talk about the role of difficulty in learning.
Ah, yes. This is a really interesting one.
Yeah.
The sources argue that when learning is harder, it actually leads to better retention.
Wait, really? But I thought the goal was to make learning as easy as possible.
That's what we tend to think. But it turns out that a certain amount of difficulty can actually be beneficial for learning.
How so?
Well, when something is too easy, our brains don't really have to work that hard to learn it. And as a result, the information doesn't stick. But when we have to struggle a bit to learn something, it forces our brains to engage more deeply with the material. And that deeper engagement leads to stronger memories.
So it's like our brains are building more robust connections when we have to work for it.
Exactly. It's like the difference between walking on a flat surface and hiking up a hill. You're going to get a much better workout hiking uphill, even though it's harder.
That's a great analogy. But of course, not all difficulty is good.
Right. There's a difference between desirable difficulties and undesirable difficulties.
All right,
Desirable difficulties are challenges that make learning more effortful, but that ultimately lead to better understanding and retention.
So, like, what are some examples of that?
Well, things like spaced repetition and interleaving that we talked about earlier, those are both desirable difficulties because they make learning harder in the short term, but they lead to better results in the long term.
Okay, I get it. And undesirable difficulties would be things like distractions and anxiety.
Exactly. Those things just get in the way of learning. They don't actually help us to learn better.
So we want to embrace the right kind of struggle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that everyone experiences difficulty in learning. It's normal, and it's actually a sign that your brain is working.
That's a good reminder. Now, the sources also talk about the importance of having a growth mindset. Can you explain what that is?
Sure, a growth mindset is the belief that your intelligence and abilities are not fixed, but can be developed through effort and learning.
So it's the opposite of thinking that you're just born with a certain amount of intelligence and that's it.
Exactly. People with a growth mindset believe that they can always learn and improve no matter where they start.
And that's really important for learning because it means you're more likely to persevere when things get tough.
Right, you're not going to give up easily because you believe that you can eventually succeed if you keep working at it.
Makes sense. Now, another key concept the sources highlight is metacognition.
Yes, metacognition is essentially thinking about your own thinking. It's about being aware of your own learning process and understanding your strengths and weaknesses as a learner.
So it's like being self-aware of how you learn best.
Exactly. And it's really important for becoming a more effective learner, because if you know how you learn best, you can tailor your study strategies to fit your needs.
And the sources mention this thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Oh yeah, that's a fascinating one.
Yeah.
The Dunning-Kruger effect is this cognitive bias where people who are incompetent at something tend to overestimate their abilities.
Oh, wow. So it's like they don't know what they don't know.
Exactly. And it can be a real problem because it prevents people from recognizing their own limitations and seeking out help when they need it.
So how can we avoid falling into this trap?
Well, one of the best things you can do is to regularly test yourself. Yeah. And I don't just mean taking formal exams. I mean quizzing yourself on the material you're learning.
Oh, okay.
Because when you test yourself, you're forcing yourself to confront your own knowledge gaps. And that can help you to become more aware of what you need to work on.
So testing isn't just about assessing what we know. It's also about helping us to understand what we don't know.
Exactly. And that's a really important part of metacognition.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about retrieval practice, spaced repetition, interleaving generation, mental models, desirable difficulties, growth mindset, and metacognition.
And all of these principles are interconnected, and they all work together to support effective learning.
It's like a whole system.
Exactly. And it's a system that anyone can use to improve their learning.
Now, the sources also briefly mention mnemonic devices. Are those still a useful tool for learning?
They can be, but it's important to understand their limitations. Mnemonic devices are basically memory tricks that help you to remember information.
So like acronyms and rhymes.
Exactly. Those are some common examples. They can be really helpful for remembering lists of things or specific facts, but they don't necessarily help you understand the concepts behind the information.
Right, it's like you're just memorizing the words without really understanding the meaning.
Exactly. So mnemonic devices can be a useful tool,
Mm-hmm.
but they shouldn't be your only strategy for learning.
Okay, so use them sparingly and make sure you're also focusing on understanding the material. Now, the last principle the sources discuss is reflection.
Yes, reflection is all about taking the time to think about what you've learned and how it connects to your existing knowledge.
So it's not just about passively absorbing information. It's about actively engaging with it and making it your own.
Exactly. It's about asking yourself questions like, what does this mean to me? How does this connect to what I already know? How can I apply this in my life?
And that process of reflection helps to solidify the learning and make it more meaningful.
Right. It's like you're taking the raw materials of information and building something new with them. You're creating your own understanding of the material.
And that's what real learning is all about. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a few questions to think about.
Okay.
First, which of your current study methods might be based more on tradition or intuition than on evidence? And second, what's one small change you can make to your learning habits based on what we've discussed today?
Those are great questions. And we really encourage you to explore the sources we've mentioned to learn more about this fascinating topic.
We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences with these learning strategies too, so feel free to share them with us. And until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep pushing the boundaries of your own understanding.
And remember, learning is a journey. It's not about being perfect. It's about being curious, trying new things, and embracing the challenge.
Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
See you next time.